morning. Welcome to today's genealogy program titled Meet Me at the Fair, presented by Terri Meeks, as usual. I'm Jessica Ashton from the Royal Gorge Regional Museum and History Center, and today is October 12th, 2024. And just a couple of quick announcements before we get going. We are in the middle of a four-part recreation series of community coffee discussions down at the museum. It's been a fun conversation, kind of digging into, let's see, the first week we had cycling, then we had river sports. Last week was rock climbing, and then next week, so on Wednesday the 16th, will be a discussion on hunting and fishing. So if you know anybody who is interested in hunting or fishing, or maybe might be involved with the law enforcement side of things there, let them know about this. Send them on down. It'll be at 9 a.m. at the museum, Wednesday, October 16th, at the Royal Gorge Regional Museum and History Center. And then we actually have one more community coffee the following week, and this is kind of a special one as well. We're bringing in a guest presenter, and he is a local Sasquatch investigator, Glenn Norberg. And so that discussion is on Thursday, October 24th. It's called Curious Encounters. And so Glenn's going to present us his research on Bigfoot and other strange phenomena that he's come across. And then we'll open up the conversation for people to share their own stories. So that should be a fun discussion too. Also at the museum, both of those are free, no registration required. But come on down and join the conversation. With that, I think that's all the announcements I have. As always, if you have any questions or comments during the presentation at any time, you can drop them into the chat and we'll circle back around to them at the end. All right, and I will hand it over to Terri.
Good morning. It is fall, October, and what better time than to go to the fair? So one of the first questions that popped into my head, even then I came up with the topic, I go, what does this really have to do with genealogy? And I figured, well, really almost nothing. But in starting to dig into it, I realized that perhaps they are more far-reaching and they will add stories to our family histories. So one of the first questions I have is, have you attended a World's Fair? I attended the 1964 one in New York City and just wondered if anybody else had done the same thing. But the stories that I have uncovered will expand and add to your story as well as those of your ancestor. So what was the purpose of the World's Fairs? The world, when World's Fairs were first started, was really pretty insular and pretty small. So the idea was to bring culture from other nations, history from other nations, and of course, introduce new technology to the people so that they could bring it back to their countries. They wanted to have a single event, a centralized event, where people could congregate and see all of these marvelous things. They also wanted to provide a glimpse into the future. Many of the new inventions, many of the products that had been introduced were introduced to the world at the World's Fairs. And it gave the host cities a huge opportunity for economic growth and development. And we will see that in all of these fairs. And finally, as I just said, they introduced visitors to far off lands. World's Fairs, there is a governing board. Now, World's Fairs predate 1928, but by that time, they decided that they needed some form of oversight and guidance. They wanted to regulate the frequency and the quality of the World's Fairs. So they did set up this Bureau of International Exhibitions. The United States has actually hosted more than 24 World's Fairs, but they were not, very few of them were actually sanctioned by the BIE. And those that were sanctioned in the United States are the ones that I'm going to cover this morning. But I'll also probably mention those that appeared elsewhere. The first modern World's Fair took place in 1851, and we see it as the Crystal Palace exhibition. It was organized by Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's husband, and it was to showcase the modern industrial technology of England, and especially to kind of lord over the superiority of English technology at the time. The Crystal Palace did exist for a number of years, almost 100. It finally was completely destroyed by fire in 1936. It was an extremely profitable World's Fair. It did bring in a lot of money, and those funds were used to establish the Victoria and Albert Museum, the Museum of Natural History, and the Science Museum in London. Some of the things that appeared at this World's Fair, for example, Matthew Brady, the Civil War photographer, he went on to become famous for his Civil War photography. This is 1851. He won a silver medal for his daguerreotypes. There were also some exhibits of the largest diamond that had been found at that time. The America's Cup yacht race was introduced at this particular fair. And there was also something that was called a tempest prognosticator. And this was a barometer using leeches. Unusual, to say the least. So let's look at some of the U.S. World's Fairs. The first one was the Centennial Exhibition. It was held in Philadelphia. And each one of the World's Fairs has a special theme. This one was the arts, manufactures, and products of the soil and mind. And it celebrated the centennial of the Declaration of Independence. 26 of the 37 existing states constructed buildings, and there were displays from 50 nations. The fairgrounds encompassed 450 acres, and this was publicly funded. So a committee got together at least a couple of years ahead of time, started raising funds for the construction of things. It's also important to point out that the displays, the buildings, etc., for virtually all of these World's Fairs were designed for demolition. They were not designed as permanent structures. So over 10 million people actually attended this particular fair. Here is a map of the grounds. And we see that there's a river, and they used river traffic, boats, and rail and trolley lines to have access to the fairgrounds. The fair was pretty much in the upper left-hand corner, but they wanted to make it accessible to everyone in the community. There were 200 buildings that were constructed for this fair. 5 of them were huge, grand structures. But Here again, many of them were temporary. The Kansas and Colorado building, it was a shared building, and it actually contained a Capitol dome built with apples. So some interesting stuff. This is the horticulture building. This is one of two buildings that did remain after the end of the fair. And it was subject to hurricanes in Philadelphia, as well as neglect. And finally, in 1955, it was demolished. So almost 100 years later. The main hall, which was not that horticulture hall, the main hall was covered 35 acres. At the time, it was the largest building ever constructed. The Corliss Centennial steam engine, it provided the electricity for the buildings and the exhibits. And it was one of the first times that electricity was used. The first public demonstration of the telephone, and Alexander Graham Bell had invented it, but this was the first public demonstration. And the arm for the Statue of Liberty was actually on exhibit, and it was to raise money for the construction of the whole monument. The first model kindergarten was also on display, complete with students. They had displays of typewriters and sewing machines. The kudzu plant was introduced to prevent soil erosion. And if any of you are familiar with the southeastern part of the United States, you know that kudzu visibly grows. If you stand still, you might be encompassed by kudzu. So it has turned out to be a nuisance rather than a good cattle feed. Also introduced were many new foods to the general public. Hires root beer, ketchup, the Band-Aid. And we always think of, we take it for granted that you can buy bananas, but in 1876, they were finally introduced to the United States. Here is a monorail. So if you had been to the Seattle World's, actually several of the World's Fairs featured monorails, but as early as 1876, there was also a monorail. I'm not sure I would have wanted to be on that one. The Remington typographic machine. It was designed by Mr. Scholes, and it did, even then, feature the QWERTY keyboard, the QWERTY top line, but it only typed capital letters. I assume the keyboard is under this bottom section. Popcorn. Mr. I.L. Baker advertised his celebrated sugar popcorn. And we see from newspaper accounts the influence that the fair had. We see how rooming houses were opened up. So in terms of genealogy, did your family open their home and take in some temporary boarders that might have attended the World's Fair? We also see young people or other people that are writing up newspaper articles and sharing their experiences. We see Mr. Galbraith, who was a conductor, and he is regaling people with his account of the exhibition. And we also see that a young lady appeared that had 7 foot long hair. And here again, in terms of genealogy, we see it requires 13,000 people to run the exposition. That's just on the daily manning exhibitions, manning booths that demonstrated products. But what about all the construction workers who actually built those 200 buildings? In 1893, in Chicago, they hosted the Columbian Exposition. And like previous fairs, the theme was the discovery of America, and it celebrated Columbus's arrival in the New World. 34 states and the U.S. and 4 U.S. territories had pavilions, and 46 countries, 690 acres. So we are growing. And here again, it was a publicly funded exhibition. And this time, 27 million people came to the fair. We see a map with the layout, and you'll notice this pier, and you're going to see that later for the fairgrounds. It showed Chicago had risen from the ashes of the Great Fire. And it was also a social and a cultural event. It did introduce people to arts for the first time and architecture. Here again, 200 new buildings were built, but here again, they were temporary. And they went all out in Chicago and had canals and lagoons. And it's interesting to point out that this area where they developed was originally a marshland. So they filled it in with fill dirt in order to construct all of this. And we'll see that same trend in some of the other World's Fairs as well. Here's one of those lagoons, and you realize all of these buildings are temporary buildings. So it's really rather awe-inspiring that they took the time to construct this and then had to deconstruct it. The 1893 fair was the first one that had an amusement area, and it introduced the Ferris wheel. On those canals and lagoons, they had life-size replicas of Columbus's Nina, Pinta, and Santa Maria. It had the first commercial movie theater, and Little Egypt introduced the Hoochie Coochie. And we're going to see the first moving walkway. Here's the Ferris wheel. And there's our moving walkway that goes all the way out to the end of the pier. It introduced also something called the clasp locker. That was the forerunner of the zipper. It was interesting to find out that it was the first time that the Pledge of Allegiance was performed in public. And here again, we have the introduction to the world of various foods that we just take for granted today. Of the buildings, here again, only 2 buildings were saved at the end of the fair. The Palace of Fine Arts is now the Museum of Science and History in Chicago, and the World's Congress Auxiliary Building is now the Art Institute of Chicago. This 1893 fair was the area was known as the White City because of the electrification, but the lights were all white. So it was known as the White City. Not only did we have inventions like Cracker Jacks, and it was interesting that the key selling point with this was they discovered the process to avoid the fact that the popcorn and the peanuts stuck together. Interesting. So, but some of the famous people that attended this fair was huge, 27 million people. And it came at a really important scientific time. Thomas Edison, Nikola Tesla, Mark Twain, Susan B. Anthony, Helen Keller, Buffalo Bill Cody, Scott Joplin, the musician. These people all attended this fair. And we see from newspaper accounts that families and people just like you and me, attended the fair. And then there's rule write-ups, what the exposition teaches us. No person can afford to let the opportunity pass without making an honest effort to see it. Despite the fact that extortions is practical in some of the walks of Chicago, the fair can be seen for a nominal sum of money. Railroad rates will be reduced nearly 1/2 sooner or later, and it is possible for every person in moderate circumstances to enjoy the benefits and profit by the unparalleled advantages for enlightenment. Higher civilization commands every person to make sacrifices for the great exposition. So, glorious revolt. And here we have more write-ups of people, local people, who actually attended the fair. One of the other things apropos of that fair, they did have a gondola that went around, that was the fair where Josephine Garris Cochran, she displayed a dishwashing machine. And because she was at the fair, the men decided that nobody's going to buy a woman-invented product. So she was fortunate enough in that she shelved her invention, and it wasn't until the 1904 World's Fair that she was able to gain patents for her dishwashing machine. So 11 years later. The 1904 Louisiana Purchase Exposition in St. Louis, Missouri. It celebrated the 100th anniversary of the Louisiana Purchase and the doubling, essentially, of the United States territory. 43 of the 45 states had exhibitions, and 60 countries. And this was probably the largest in terms of acreage at 1,270 acres. This one was not wholly publicly funded, but indeed relied on local, state, and for the first time, federal funds. 20 million people actually attended the St. Louis World's Fair. Here's the map showing the World's Fairs, and we see how different areas are focused on arts, sciences, industry, as well as having outdoor areas. Over 1,500 buildings were constructed, and electricity was the star of the show. Educational and scientific displays also were the main focus, but there were displays of art history, architecture, and anthropology. So we're seeing more social, a movement towards more social and more people-oriented exhibits in this fair. Even though the last one introduced an amusement area, there was entertainment, new foods, popular music, and because of some of the international exhibits, we see exotic people. Innovations in communication, medicine, and transportation were primarily featured. And we see the elaborate construction of some of these buildings. Look at the front of that building. And we have the band shell that has seating at an angle. Look at all the statuary that is all around, all this art and architecture. The wireless telephone, which eventually became the radio, was exhibited. Something called a telautograph, which was the forerunner of the fax machine. The X-ray machine made its public debut. An infant incubator, and it did actually have infants in the incubators that were on display. We had the electric typewriter in one of the previous. Now we have an electric typewriter. We have Paulson's telegraphing, which essentially was an answering machine. And we have the first public flight of a dirigible in America. And this is that forerunner of the fax machine. Our dirigible. It was also the first use of the automobile by mail carriers. And it's interesting to point out, it was probably an electric automobile, not a gasoline-powered automobile. They had an underwater battleship, what we know as a submarine. They had a waffle-style ice cream cone. And that has an interesting story behind it. The man that was, there were two men, exhibitors. One was doing ice cream cones and one was doing essentially waffles. The ice cream cone man ran out of ice cream cones and he asked the man at the waffle stand if he could make something to hold his ice cream. He folded it into a cone and thus became the waffle style ice cream cone. Dr. Pepper was introduced, and Florida exhibited a pomelo, a hybridized version of the pomelo, which became known as the grapefruit. Did not know that. Here's Dr. Pepper. It was developed in 1885, but we see now in 1904 that it's being introduced to the world. And originally, Dr. Pepper was Dr. with a period Pepper, and the period was dropped in the 1950s. Colorado connections. The original mechanical doll, Lady Blythe Marvin. She was from Park County, and she was discovered at the age of 7 being a live doll. And she did this throughout her life and was extremely faithful to this. She could hold still, and people marveled. They stood in store windows and marveled to see, would she move? Would she blink her eyes? Her last performance was in 1958, and she is buried here in Lakeside Cemetery in Canyon City. Another Canyon City connection in the 1904 World's Fair. I believe his name was Ferdinand Stockter. He made mineral waters, and he sent 20 bottles to the World's Fair and won a silver medal. He had various flavors, and his store was originally on Main Street here in Canyon City. And we see again from the newspapers, we see railroad advertisements. You know, we have the lines straight to go from these various places for your convenience to get to the World's Fair. I like the one in the middle. In Louisiana's World's Fair exhibit, there will be shown 98 varieties of mosquitoes. They are in cases and are guaranteed not to bite or sting, thankfully. So we see little quips from various newspapers about people attending the fair and other information as to what's on exhibit. In 1915, the Panama Pacific International Exposition was held in San Francisco, and it celebrated the completion of the Panama Canal. 26 states constructed buildings. Arkansas and Oklahoma shared a building, as did the Hawaiian Islands and Philippines, but New York City had its own building separate from the state. 24 countries participated, and we realized that this was during World War I. So many of the European countries did not attend. It was on 636 acres of land in San Francisco. And this is another one of those cases where they filled in land. They filled in marshy, boggy land to develop the fair. 19 million visitors came to the fair. Here's our traditional map where we see food products, agriculture, transportation, gardens, horticulture, liberal arts. And it showcased San Francisco's ability to recover from the 1906 earthquake. There were 11 large exhibition palaces and 1,500 sculptures. This fair had the largest amusement area of the fairs up to this date, and it actually had an aviation field. Here again, buildings were constructed for temporary usage. And we see some of these grand structures that were not permanent. Of those that were permanent, the Palace of Fine Arts was maintained until 1964. And what they did with that is they essentially deconstructed the building down to its basic framework, and they reconstructed it 10 years later in 1974. The only other building that was saved at this fair was the San Francisco Exposition Auditorium, which is now the Bill Graham Civic Auditorium. Many of the things at several of these World's Fairs were moved elsewhere. So, and we'll see a couple of pictures about that. There was a 5-acre reproduction of the Panama Canal. So huge. The first transcontinental telephone call, Alexander Graham Bell came to the fair and actually made a phone call to the East Coast. The ukulele, which we always associate with Hawaii, it is a Portuguese instrument. It was first introduced at the 1915 World's Fair. Ford actually set up an assembly line, and it actually ran through the duration of the World's Fair. Something else that was interesting to me and has a little bit of a Canyon City connection is that the Liberty Bell made a cross-country trip. This was also the first time that the role of women was important. The women actually did have a women's pavilion. And it was actually advertising. You know, we see the Ford assembly line, and we'll see other things that were focused on advertising. Here is the assembly line. They introduced new fruit hybrids, cookware, Napa Valley wines. And we see international foods that were introduced for the first time that we take for granted today. Temporary. Many of the buildings were destroyed. Others were moved elsewhere. There was a Japanese tea house that in the same fashion was floated down to, I believe it was Belmont, California, and still exists today. Famous attendees, Alexander Graham Bell, he demonstrated that transcontinental phone call. Maria Montessori, who started the Montessori schools. Buffalo Bill Cody, Henry Ford was actually there. Laura Ingalls Wilder attended as a child, and Jack London and a preteen Ansel Adams, the famous photographer, also attended. And we see some of the write-ups from the fair. It was really interesting in terms of newspapers. They held subscription competitions, and the winners of these competitions might get free expense-paid travel to the World's Fair. So did one of your relatives perhaps enter one of these competitions as a newspaper deliverer? And the Liberty Bell might come to Canyon City. It was shipped by rail across country. And apparently Ms. Garwood, who was the superintendent of schools, did receive a letter that indicated that there was a possibility that it might come through by rail through Canyon City. I was not able to find any kind of confirmation as to whether this did occur or not. In 1933, we're back in Chicago for the Century of Progress, and how industry and scientific research depend on one another. We have to realize that this was during the Great Depression. So there were 427 acres that were developed, and it was funded by a nonprofit corporation. At this point, people were unemployed. The FDR had introduced his Works Progress Administration to get people back working. So this was another opportunity for people to find work. A map of the fair. And it was very well attended. 39 million people actually attended the fair. And it marked Chicago's 100th anniversary. Since it was the Depression, they wanted hope. And they wanted people to see a vision for the future. They wanted to illustrate how products were made and show off those finished product. And they wanted workers to see the importance of their daily work and how those finished products influenced our culture and our society. Unite cultures through technology. The world was suffering through the Depression at this time. So there were other ways. This was one of the ways to show people of the world that these technological advances would benefit them. There were a lot of new automobile designs. There was something called a bathysphere submersible. They introduced houses of the future. And like the monorail, now we have a sky ride. It was a people mover, but rather than like we saw on the wharf, we're going above the buildings of Chicago. And the first Major League All-Star baseball game was played during the World's Fair. This is one of those bathyspheres. It does not look comfortable. The House of Tomorrow. This was a 12-sided. It featured an electric dishwasher, and it did have air conditioning. So there's our people mover. And here again, we see it over the city. And it was higher than any building in Chicago. Remember I told you the previous Chicago World's Fair was the White City? Here we get the Rainbow City. They wanted to point out new styles of modern architecture. So buildings were angular and virtually all of the buildings were painted colors. And they wanted it to be the Rainbow City and to give people hope. We have the introduction of various people. We have guides that actually worked at the fair, making comments. And let's get some oddities from the fair. There was an old Morocco nightclub where future stars Judy Garland and the Andrews sisters performed. There was what we would today consider socially inappropriate. There was a midget city. Admiral Byrd's expedition ship, the City of New York, was on display. We talked about the new introduction of new cars. Ralston, Nash, Duesenberg, Cadillac, Pierce Arrow, Packard were all on display. And the very famous painting, Whistler's Mother, was also on display. So the 1939-40 New York World's Fair. was held in New York City, building the world of tomorrow. So here again, we're always looking to the future. It was the 150th anniversary of Washington's inauguration as president, and it was between the Great Depression and World War II. So we see 33 countries occupying 1,200 acres. And it was the second most expensive fair to actually construct. 44 million people attended. Here is one of the exhibit areas. And we have an international zone. We have a transportation zone. And we have an amusement zone. So they wanted to have a better understanding of technology, consumer products, and the lifetimes, the products of our parents and our grandparents. So they were kind of looking backward at the same time that they were looking forward. Let's make our parents and our grandparents' lives better and endorse an appreciation of the advancements. Medicine was one of the main focuses of this particular fair. Travel and daily living. And what's interesting is a social health exhibit to educate people about venereal disease, an entire exhibit about this. And we realize this is a time between the Depression and World War II, but during World War II, venereal disease was one of the major contributors to illness among the troops. President Roosevelt opened the fair with a television broadcast. Color photographs were available, air conditioning, the fax machine. We saw the forerunner to the fax machine. Now we have the fax machine. Nylon, lucite, these synthetic products, pantyhose. I didn't know that they came about this early. The Viewmaster, where you could see the pictures. They actually buried a time capsule that was supposed to be opened in 5,000 years. Yeah. Actually, let me go back to that. The Times capsule, it contained a child's Mickey Mouse doll, a cup, a Kewpie doll, a Gillette safety razor, a pack of Camels, a Sears Roebuck catalog, an RCA television, a Hammond organ. So this time capsule must have been huge. So, we see the perisphere, the circular one, and the trilon, futuristic. This is the General Motors Pavilion. And look at the lines of the people. Futuristic transportation modes. How electric energy was produced. The colorful national cash register. And this is the daily attendance that is shown in the numbers. And this was one of the first times that I was able to find what an international exhibit looked like. And we see some of the people, how they got to the fair. Here's a school teacher that was given the gift of attending the fair. So the New York World's Fair in the same year was a BIE sanctioned fair. The Golden Gate Exposition on the West Coast in the same years was not a BIE sanctioned fair. But it was an important exhibit. It was held in San Francisco, celebrating the completion of the Golden Gate and San Francisco Oakland Bay bridges, and celebrating also the Pacific Rim countries. It was here again, just like the other, between the Depression and World War II. WPA essentially funded most of the fair. They wanted to reclaim the land in the San Francisco area, and it actually wound up being the area that is known as Treasure Island. There were 400 acres, 17 million people did attend, and they realized that at this particular time, after the Depression, that few people could go all the way to New York. So this is why they had one on each coast. It would create jobs and it would attract new industry and investment to the San Francisco area. Here is the map from that fair. And ironically, it focused on Pacific unity, showcased the goods of nations bordering on the Pacific Ocean and their cultures. The Far East was significantly different than the United States. So they wanted people to see all that, as well as to present the natural wonders of the western part of our country. President Roosevelt opened the fair with a television broadcast from New York to San Francisco. There was a lavish use of electric lights. The 1939 NCAA basketball tournament was played at this World Fair, and they actually had a volcano that erupted. The Treasure Island was leased by the Navy to support World War II, and it actually became an airport. About the only buildings that remain from this particular World Fair were the administration building, which is now the Treasure Island Museum, and there were 2 pavilions that are now hangars. The Tower of the Sun from the U.S. Postal Service. The Court of Seven Seas and Pacifica. And we see the influence of the Far East. The Chinese village. The Japanese pavilion. The Johor State Pavilion. The Philippines. And we see for a year, William Baker, interesting name, worked 6 hours daily baking this fruitcake, which is on display at the San Francisco World's Fair. A replica of the cake. Built exactly to scale, includes 7 twin California missions. So people did unusual things. The 1962 Century Exhibition in Seattle. And we're very familiar with that. Living in the space age, 10 million people attended. and it's on 74 acres, a small portion. This is incorrect. It was BIE sanctioned. It was the 1939-40 San Francisco Fair. So this is a correction. And this was the first fair that concentrated on urban renewal. They purposefully planned to reuse buildings. And the fairs, because the Russians had already launched Sputnik, they wanted to show that we were not behind the Russians in the space race. We have the Space Needle, which exists still today, the Alweg monorail, a bubbleator. Friendship 7 was on display. An underground world home. And interestingly enough, Belgium waffles were introduced, which we now know as Belgian waffles. A pager, a cordless phone, and something called a computer were introduced. We see the Space Needle, the monorail. This is the bubbleator. Your underground home. And we have Elvis Presley filmed It Happened at the World's Fair. And interestingly enough, they're eating the Belgium waffle. And that is 7-year-old Vicky Tu Liu, who served as the First Lady of Hawaii. Sammy Davis Jr., John Wayne, LBJ, John Glenn, Walt Disney, Lawrence Welk, all attended the World's Fair. And many of the buildings have been saved. The cordless phone and the computer. So where do you come up with this information? For the most part, all of these fairs occurred in non-census years. So you're not going to find anything in the census. We usually rely on that. City directories may point you to someone who worked in construction before or after one of these World's Fairs, or who was employed by one of the vendors at the World's Fair, etc. But for the most part, newspapers and books are going to be your sources to rely on. The host cities all have museums and archives that do have information about the World's Fairs in their particular cities. And just broad general Google searches will give you information. In preparing this presentation, I believe it was 2 weeks ago, I received this information from American Ancestors, the New England Historical and Genealogical Society. They have a brand new database that focuses on World's Fairs and the various records and different things from them. So perhaps if you think about an ancestor that might have been involved in one of these, there might be something there to be found. In the interest of time, I did not have time to cover the 1968 World's Fair in San Antonio. And many of the buildings from that fair still exist today, but it's an area that is going through successive urban renewal. I mentioned early on that the United States had participated in over 24 World's Fairs, not all sanctioned by the BIE, but they occurred in Louisville, Cincinnati, Nashville, Omaha, Buffalo, Charleston, Portland, Jamestown, San Diego, Philadelphia, New Orleans, Knoxville, San Antonio, Dallas, Cleveland. There was a 1984 World's Fair in New Orleans. It was not BIE sanctioned, but it celebrated the world of rivers, and the Space Shuttle Enterprise was on display. So check out the World's Fairs and think about how your family might have been involved. Did someone work to construct? Did they demonstrate some of the products that might have been there? And when did some of these products appear in your home? And were you or one of your family among the thousands of visitors who worked or attended the fair? I'll turn it over to Miss Jessica.
Thank you, Terry. As always, that was great. It has made me wish I could time travel and be at these places. And I can only imagine the excitement and the high energy nowadays. We kind of take it for granted that we have the world at our fingertips to just learn about different places or see the technology. That must have really been something. Yeah, so come on down to the museum if you ever have any more questions. You want to dig deeper into some of this. We're at 612 Royal Gorge Boulevard here in Canyon City. And we hope to see you for our next genealogy program, which will be Saturday, November 9th. Siemens Protection Certificates. Same time, same place. Thank you. Bye.